This is Lecture 54C in the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018. This will be part of Volume 3, Communism in East Asia, next year when it appears. The subject matter, I mean. This lecture today is the last one on Siberia and Mongolia. It's the Imperial Mongolian Slave Stage Empire, which existed during the 1200s and 1300s AD and was history's largest contiguous land empire. It originated in the steppes of Central Asia. The Mongol Empire eventually stretched west to east from Central Europe and Southwest Asia, that is Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, and the Iranian Plateau to the Pacific Ocean. From north to south, it encompassed all of Siberia and Mongolia, of course, extended into the Indian subcontinent and Indochina. And it never actually was defeated. It did fade away, and at the end of this lecture we'll talk about how it got absorbed by the Chinese. Currently on Netflix, both seasons of the series Marco Polo are streaming, and as difficult as the series is to follow sometimes, because of our unfamiliarity with all of the facial characteristics of the Asian actors, I think it's well worth watching. Many of the places, persons, and events covered in this chapter and the accompanying lecture is shown as accurately as possible under the circumstances. Now, the Mongol Empire emerged from the unification of the preceding kingdoms and empires of Siberian and Mongolian slavocrat class rule of city-states and empires, such as Xiongnu, and we reviewed all of that last time. The Mongol homeland was therefore equal to the territory as occupied by these preceding brick and adobe city-states and urban tent cities. It emerged as the Great Empire under the leadership of Genghis Khan as ruler of all Mongols in AD 1206. State authority had for many centuries been expanding in the form of both secret police and armed forces acting internally and externally as required by the ruling classes. With the emergence of the Great Empire of Genghis Khan, there was a great expansion of the land forces, not to exclude expanding naval forces as needed. Accordingly, we will now take a close look at the structure, strategy, and tactics of those forces. In accordance with Mongol civil and social structure, outstanding obedience and firm discipline provided the backbone for their military. Italian explorer Giovanni da Pian del Caprine is often quoted as saying, "The Tatars, or the Mongols, that's Tatars, are the most obedient people in the world with regard to their leaders. They hold them in the greatest reverence and never tell them a lie," unquote. Well, discipline was the central doctrine, that's for sure, and this often made all the differences as enemies of the great empire confronted even regular armies, at any rate, were not so much more than bandit hordes. Genghis Khan's army officers and non-coms were chosen for loyalty and based on merit. Blood association with the Khan family was the best possible initial qualification for loyalty. However, for million-man armies, a performance-rated merit system was essential and most fundamental. In the meritocracy, each commanding officer was assigned specific responsibilities. Each command had its respective title. Each commanding officer had lower-class originating non-commissioned officers, or NCOs, to do the actual handling of the private soldiers. And then I go through a lot of the details, but just in short, the smallest unit was the platoon, commanded by a lieutenant called an arban, and he had 3 squads of 5 to 10 men each. Then there was a captain called a zun, who commanded companies with multiple platoons totaling hundreds of men. Then a major called a mengan, who had battalions of 3 companies totaling thousands of men. And finally a lieutenant colonel or colonel commanding a 2-man TUMEN, which were regiments of 3 battalions totaling 10,000 men or entire divisions. Transfers between units were forbidden. The leaders on each level had significant license to execute their orders in the way they considered best. This command structure proved to be highly flexible. Most importantly, it allowed the Mongol army to attack en masse, then divide into somewhat smaller groups, thereby having the desired smashing weight effect and simultaneously able to encircle, and/or to lead armies into an ambush or divide into squads to mop up a fleeing and broken army. Individual soldiers were responsible for their equipment, weapons, and from 3 to 5 horses. Soldier families and family herds were camp followers, accompanying their men on foreign expeditions. Now, they had what we would call special forces. They call it Kheshig, Kheshig. It was a breeding ground for military excellence. They were the equivalents of the Russian Spetsnaz, the British SAS, the U.S. SEAL Delta, Army Green Beret, and Marine Raider forces. These Kheshig special forces were an elite force that stood above all units in terms of respect, and they functioned as the Imperial Guard of the Mongol Empire and as Napoleonic Old Guard shock forces to be employed as needed in campaigns. They were a training ground for potential young officers being fast-tracked to high roles. The great Empire General Subutai started his career there. Subutai became a Uriankai general and the primary military strategist of Genghis Khan and Ogadai Khan. The name Uriankai itself means warlord in Mongolian. At the beginning of the Mongol Empire, 1206 to 1368, the Uriankai were located in central Mongolia. Anyway, Subutai directed more than 20 campaigns in which he conquered 32 nations and won 65 pitched battles. In total, he conquered more territory than any other commander in history. Subutai's victories were consistently based on imaginative, sophisticated strategies. Furthermore, he routinely coordinated movements of armies that were hundreds of miles away from each other. He organized a campaign that destroyed the armies of Hungary and Poland within 2 days of each other, and that by forces that were over 300 miles apart. Each Mongol soldier typically maintained 3 to 4 horses, changing mounts while traveling fast for days without stopping and without wearing out the animals. Dragoons, or mounted soldiers, could live off the land. In extremis, they could live off their horses, that is, mare's milk or even the horse meat itself. Therefore, their logistical requirements left much unseen. Mounted soldiers went on scouting missions to gather intelligence about routes and the best terrain for combat. In AD 1241, during the invasions of Hungary and Poland, the entire assaulting Mongol armies covered 100 miles per day. During the assault on Kiev, the Mongols used frozen rivers as highways, proving that winter, far from the time of year usually off limits for any mounted army or army-sized action, it became the Mongols' preferred time to strike. To avoid the deadly hail of missiles, foot soldiers would frequently spread out or seek cover. This only made them more vulnerable to Mongol dragoons and their lancing charges. Conversely, when they packed themselves together into a dense square or phalanx-style formations, they would become more vulnerable to massed arrows. Mongol armies practiced horsemanship, archery, and unit tactics, formations, and rotations repeatedly, and maintained by hard work, not an overly harsh or unreasonable discipline. As long as the objectives of the plan were well served and the orders properly obeyed, all was fair in war. The Mongols avoided pitfalls of overly rigid discipline and micromanagement. All horse soldiers had to be unconditionally loyal to each other and to their superiors, especially to the Khan. If one soldier ran from danger in battle, he and his 9 comrades from the same Arban would face punishment collectively. In one Arban, 6 of every 10 Mongol troopers were light cavalry horse archers. The remaining 4 were heavily armored and armed lancers. Mongol light cavalry were extremely light troops compared to their contemporary standards, allowing them to execute tactics and maneuvers that would have been impractical for a heavier enemy, such as the European knights. Most of the remaining troops were heavier cavalry with lances for close combat after the archers had brought the enemy into disarray. Soldiers usually carried scimitars or halberds as well. The Mongols protected their horses in the same way as they did themselves, covering them with layered armor. Horse armor was divided into 5 parts and designed to protect every part of the horse, including the forehead, which had a specially crafted plate, which was tied on each side of the horse's neck. Mongolian horses are relatively small but extremely hardy, self-sufficient, and long-winded. These horses could survive in climates that would have killed other breeds, enabling the Mongols to launch successful winter attacks on Russia. Mongol horses typically do not require a daily supply of grain. Their ability to forage grass and twigs on their own and to survive on such fodder helped free the Khan's army from the need for supply lines. The Mongol horse has excellent stamina. Its 18-mile traditional race between Mongol horses and Arabian breeds or thoroughbred breeds has found that the latter are faster, but the Mongol horses are better able to run for a longer period of time. The tireless nature of the Mongol horse meant that it would have stayed fresh longer in battle, granted Genghis Khan's armies an endurance at advantage. And since each soldier had 3 to 5 horses, he could switch off frequently so the horses did not get too tired. Seen as a machine of war, the Mongol horse is an all-terrain, all-weather vehicle requiring little gas or maintenance and providing excellent mileage. A warrior relied on his herd to provide him with staple foods of milk and meat. Its hide could be used for bowstrings, shoes, and armor. Dried horse shit was used as fuel for campfires. Horsehair was used to make rope, battle standards, musical instruments, and helmet decorations. Mare milk was used in ceremonies to ensure victory, and horse milk was used while hunting. If a mounted soldier died in battle, a horse might be sacrificed with him to provide a mount for the afterlife. The main drawback to Mongol horses was their lack of speed. They would lose short-distance races under equal conditions with larger horses from other regions. However, since most other armies carried much heavier armor, the Mongols could still outrun most enemy horsemen in battle. And in addition, Mongolian horses were extremely durable and sturdy, allowing the Mongols to move over large distances quickly, often surprising enemies that had expected them to arrive days or even weeks later. All horses were equipped with stirrups. This technical advantage made it easier for the Mongol or archers to turn their upper body and shoot in all directions, including backwards. Mongol warriors would in time loosen an arrow, and when a galloping horse would have all 4 feet off the ground, thus ensuring a steady, well-aimed shot, he would fire the arrow. Each soldier had 2 to 4 horses, so when a horse tired, they could change to one of the others. This made them one of the fastest armies in the world, but also made the Mongol army vulnerable to shortages of fodder. Campaigning in arid regions such as Central Asia or forested regions of southern China were thus difficult, and even in ideal steppe terrain, a Mongol force had to keep moving to ensure sufficient grazing for its massive horse herd. Once the enemy was sufficiently weakened, the officers would give the order. The drums would beat and the signal flags wave, telling the lancers to begin their charge. Often the devastation of the arrows was enough to rout an enemy. Then the lancers were tasked to pursue and mop up the remnants. In the Hungarian-Polish campaign, at the Battle of Mohi, the Mongols left open a gap in their ranks, luring the Hungarians in. This resulted in the Hungarian foot soldiers being strung out all over the countryside. Then, in their flight, they became easy pickings for mounted archers who simply galloped along and picked them off, and the lancers skewered those targets of opportunity as they fled. Mongol armies traveled light. They were able to live off the land. The Mongol soldiers' personal equipment included fishhooks and other entrenching tool-sized spades meant to make each warrior independent of any fixed supply source. The most common travel food of the Mongols was dried and ground meat called borts. Borts are light and easy to transport and can be cooked with water, similarly to a modern Marashan instant soup. Varieties of borts are common in Mongolian cuisine today. As we have seen, each trooper usually had 3 or 4 mounts at least, so most of the Mongols' mounts were mares, and they were able to live off their horses' milk or milk products as they moved through enemy territory. In other words, the horse was milked and slaughtered for meat. If necessary, the Mongol warrior could drink some of the blood from his string of remounts. A soldier could survive a month by drinking mare's milk combined with mare's blood and nothing more. Always reliable supply trains brought up heavier equipment. Wagons and carts also carried large stockpiles of arrows. The main logistical factor limiting their advance was finding enough food and water for their animals. When a general is moving hundreds of thousands of men and 3 to 5 times that many animals, you can see that advanced scouting and planning for pasture lands is critical. When Mongol generals moved into Southwest Asia, as in their conflicts with the Egyptian Mamluks, the arid terrain of Syria and the Levant made the lack of adequate pasture acreage into a de facto brick wall. It brought the lightning advanced tactics of the nomads to a screeching halt. The Mamluks adopted a scorched earth tactic of burning grazing lands throughout the region, and it also limited the Mongols' ability to exploit their success in Europe following the Battle of Mohi. General Subutai encountered this tactic on the Great Hungarian Plain. Existing limited acreage was burned so that there was insufficient grazing land for all the flocks and herds for the Mongolian general. The Mongols established a system of postal relay pony express style horse stations. This had been the system employed in ancient Persia for fast transfer of written messages. The Mongol mail system was an empire-wide service. Mongol battlefield communications used signal flags, horns, and signal arrows to communicate movement orders during combat. The basic uniform of the Mongol fighting man was a long robe coat fastened at the waist by a leather belt. From the belt would hang his sword, dagger, and an axe. The fur-lined coat was a form of armor, doubled left breast over right. This armor coat was anchored with a button a few inches below the right armpit. A soldier's heavy long coat could be reinforced with metal plates when desired. Underneath the coat, the Mongol soldier wore protective heavy silk undershirts with long wide sleeves. Even if an arrow pierced this armor mail or the leather outer garment, the silk from the undershirt would wrap itself around the arrow as it entered the body, in this way making removal of the arrow easier, minimizing damage caused by the arrow's shaft. Mongol soldiers' boots were made from felt and leather, heavy enough to armor the feet and yet comfortable. The boots were wide enough to accommodate the trousers tucked in before tight lacing. Boots were without heels, though the soles were thick and lined with fur. Worn with felt socks, the feet were unlikely to get cold, and the horses appreciated the lack of hard kicks. Labilla chain metal armor was worn over the thick coat. This armor was composed of small scales of iron, chainmail, or hard leather, sewn together with leather tongs, and the whole thing weighed about 22 pounds. Boiling first softened the leather and it was waterproofed with a pine pitch lacquer. Cone-shaped helmets were composed of iron or steel plates with iron-plated neck guards. Underneath the helmet was a conical cap made of quilted cotton with a large turned-up brim, reversible in winter when it formed earmuffs. Mounted archers were a major part of the armies of the Mongol Empire. On April 9th in AD 1241 at the Battle of Liegnitz in southwest Poland, a Mongol army used 20,000 horse archers to defeat Silesian Duke Henry II's 30,000 armored troops. The primary weapons of the Mongol forces were composite bows made from laminated horn, wood, and sinew. A layer of horn is on the inner face as it resists compression, while a layer of sinew is on the outer face. These had been the main weapons of steppe herdsman and steppe warrior for over 2,000 years. Mongols and many of their subject peoples were extremely skilled with them. Soldiers bragged they could hit a bird on the wing. Composite construction allows a powerful and relatively efficient bow to be made small enough so that it can be used easily from horseback. Quivers containing 60 arrows were strapped to the backs of each cavalryman and to their horses. Mongol archers typically carried 2 to 3 bows, one heavier and intended for dismounted use, the other lighter and used for horseback, that were accompanied by multiple quivers and files for sharpening their arrowheads. These arrowheads were hardened by plunging them in brine after first heating them red hot. The Mongols could shoot an arrow over 660 feet. Targeted shots were possible at a range of 500 to 575 feet, and this determined the optimal tactical approach distance for light cavalry units. Ballistic shots could hit enemy units without targeting individual soldiers at distances of up to 1,300 feet. This was useful for surprising and scaring troops and horses before beginning the actual attack. Shooting from the back of a moving horse may be more accurate if the arrow is loosed in the phase of the gallop when all four of the horse's feet are off the ground. The Mongols used crossbows, initially acquired from the Chinese. Infantry and cavalry could also use them. The Manchus forbade archery by their Mongol subjects, that is, the Chinese emperors, and the Mongolian bow-making tradition was lost during the Qing dynasty. The present bow-making tradition emerged after independence in AD 1921 and is based on Manchu types of bow, somewhat different to the bows known to have been used by the Mongol Empire. Mongol swords were slightly curved scimitars. They were used for slashing attacks, followed up with cut and thrust. These scimitars were made to use from horseback. Warriors could use the sword with a one-handed or two-handed grip, and the scimitar blade was 2.5 feet long with a 1-foot handle. The Mongols learned about Chinese cannon and gunpowder and used these weapons against the Europeans at the Battle of Mohi. There, the Hungarians and Poles confronted flaming arrows and naphtha bombs. The Mongols used gunpowder, cannon, and exploding shells during their invasion of Japan. They had combat engineers who made siege machines, and they were an early form of artillery used by Genghis Khan attacking fortified cities. Mongol armies incorporated combat engineers who would build siege engines from materials on site. When rocks had been removed by defenders, these engineers would cut up trees into logs soaked in water to make heavy catapult rock-like charges. Initially, these engineers had been captured in China and Persia. When Mongols slaughtered whole populations from towns that resisted seizure, they would selectively spare the engineers and other specialists, offering them assimilation into the Mongol armies. As resistance was futile, engineers and specialists often accepted assimilation. The Mongol High Command then began building its own corps of combat engineers, who were quite ingenious. When planning the siege of a fortified Chinese city, these engineers knew that the defenders would remove all the large rocks from the entire region to deny the Mongols ammunition for their catapults. Accordingly, during the war against Persia, the Mongols came across Alamut Assassin's Fortress in the mountains located in the South Caspian province of Daylam, near the Rudbar region of Iran, 60 miles from present-day Tehran. It had been surrounded by Persia and was a Shia city-state, much like Tlaxcala had been to the Aztecs. In their siege of the Assassin's Fortress of Alamut, the Mongols gathered large rocks from everywhere they could, and they piled them up in an arms depot only a few days' journey from their siege lines. Thus they had a huge supply available for the breaching batteries operating against the mighty Alamut citadel. Mongol scouts found suitable higher ground for a military siege engine called a ballista. This was an engine-sized crossbow. It fired large bolts with better precision than a catapult, although with a reduced range, and allowed them sniper accuracy into the interior of the fortress. In AD 1256, the Ismaili Mongol general was forced to surrender the fortress to the invading Mongols. During the fighting, its famous library was destroyed. Today it lies in ruins, but because of its historical significance, the Iranian government is developing it as a tourist destination. Genghis Khan used the Chinese engineers and traction catapults he had assembled from his victories over the Jurchens and Tanguts during his Khwarezmian campaign. Kublai Khan later called upon Muslim engineers from Ikhanate cousins to build counterweight trebuchets or catapults. With these, he successfully concluded the 6-year siege of the twin fortified cities of Fancheng and Zhangyang in modern-day Hubei, China. From AD 1267 to AD 1273, these were the decisive battles between the invading Mongols of the Yuan dynasty and the southern Song. After the battle, the victorious Yuan forces pushed farther into the Song heartland. Previously, for 30 years, the Song dynasty had managed to handle several major offensives by the Mongol Empire. You'll see a lot of this in that show, Marco Polo. At any rate, the strategic significance of Zhangyang came from the fact that it was in a position dominating the Han River. Once the Yuan forces occupied Zhangjiang, they could travel by ships down the Han River into the Yangtze River. After the Battle of Zhangjiang, the Song dynasty could not enjoy the protection of natural barriers, and accordingly it collapsed, with the final battle being the relatively short naval battle of Yemen in AD 1279. During a siege, the Mongols would gather a crowd of local residents or soldiers into a karash, Kharash, and drive them forward as living shields, the idea being that they would take the brunt of enemy arrows and crossbow bolts, and they were forced ahead to breach walls too. Now, in terms of intelligence and Mongol strategy, the Mongol battlefield tactics were a combination of masterful training with excellent communication and discipline. Mongol soldiers were trained for every chaotic combat possibility. Mongols protected their ranking officers, allowing them to fight without the need for constant supervision. And Mongol commanders were a vital asset and found the highest ground available from which to make tactical decisions as events unfolded. The Mongols carefully scouted out and spied on their enemies in advance of any invasion. For example, before the invasion of Europe, Generals Batu and Subutai sent spies for almost 10 years earlier into the heart of Europe. There they made maps of the old Roman roads, established the supply routes, and determined the ability of each principality to resist invasion. Spies made morale estimates about each principality. Would it aid the others? If it did, what was its ability to resist alone or in combination? Mongol commanders did everything necessary to conquer targeted towns or cities. For example, they would divert entire rivers from the target, closing supplies to the city and waiting for its inhabitants to surrender. Gathering civilians to fill the front line for the city-town attack before scaling the wall was another effective tactic, as was pillaging the surrounding area and killing some of the people, allowing enough survivors to flee in panic and report to the rest of the populace. Naturally, this would weaken resistance morale, not to mention draining the resources of the target city with a sudden influx of refugees. Resistance is futile. The Mongols used this kind of psychological warfare in many battles, spreading terror and fear to towns and cities. The alternative to hopeless resistance was offered as the opportunity to surrender and pay tribute. Sedentary populations were not free to flee danger, and the ransacking and destruction of their cities was the worst they could experience. When cities accepted the offer, they were spared at the acceptable cost of supporting the conquering Mongol army. When approaching a mobile army, the units deceived them, splitting into 3 or more army groups, each trying to outflank and surprise their opponents. Thus, the Mongols would seem to appear out of nowhere, and they were seemingly more numerous than they really were. Feigned retreat was an often employed tactic. Enemies were lured into vulnerable ambush setups by Mongol scouts who would show themselves from some predetermined location long enough to entice some of these guys to chase after them. Then the scouts would disappear into the woods or behind hills while foolish pursuers maintained their wild bandit charges. The Mongols' flank troops, already strategically positioned, would appear as if out of nowhere from the left, right, or from their rear. The ambush would annihilate the pursuers and demoralize the units from which they had come. During the initial phase of battlefield combat, while camping in close proximity of their enemies at night, Mongol forces would feign numerical superiority by ordering each soldier to light at least 5 fires. And then, dragging tree branches behind their horses, they would create dust storms behind hills that could give the impression of forces too numerous to resist, encouraging the enemy to surrender. Mongols practiced the tactic of recruiting oppressed peoples to fight with them against targeted city-states, such as Cortés had done or would do in Mexico. Thus, their troop numbers increased as they fought wars of conquest. In the AD 1258 siege of the Abbasid Caliphate capital city of Baghdad, Ilkhanate Mongol victory came in association with units formed from peoples formerly held in servitude by the Caliphate. Their tactics were to advance methodically in their strategy. The 10,000 men Tumen, T-U-M-E-N, Mongol divisions would typically advance on a broad front 5 ranks deep. The first 3 ranks were composed of horse archers. The last 2 ranks were made up of lancers. Once an enemy force was located, the Mongols avoided risk and did not make reckless frontal assaults. Instead, they would use diversionary attacks to fix the enemy in place, while their main forces sought to outflank or surround the foe. The horse archers would lay down a withering barrage of arrow fire. Camels followed closely with a sufficient supply of arrows. Mongol order of battle places divisions into separate formations, each featuring 10,000-man tumans. Then smaller units were arranged within each, depending on the specific battle plan. If a number of troops to be split from the main force was significant, these would be given to a special commander, while the main force commander concentrated on the front line. The main force Mongol commander would decide the strategy, including the tactical steps to be used to attack the enemy. In Hungary, General Subutai flanked the Europeans in the Battle of Mohács by splitting his divisions into 3 separate formations. He used his Old Guard division to attack them on their right flank. Encirclement maneuvers on target cities cut off escape and overwhelmed them. When reinforcement of one side of the encirclement was indicated, the main force commander from the high ground directed his reserves or troops from another part of the encirclement to support the weak spot. If affairs went south, the Mongols would retreat to save their troops, then regroup and re-engage when Plan B was drawn up after having studied the enemy's tactics and defenses in the first battle. Alternatively, after switch tactics, he could switch tactics and again send a demand to surrender after inflicting some form of damage. There was no inflexible doctrine as to when or where units should be deployed. The Mongols practiced the feigned retreat, perhaps the most difficult battlefield tactic to execute, because a feigned rout can turn into a real rout. However, practice makes perfect. When perfected, pretending disarray and defeat in the height of battle, the Mongol soldier could appear panicked, turning and running, then pivot when their pursuers were engaged in wild bandit charges of opportunity. Roles reversed, the Mongols would destroy their former pursuers, who were now in disarray. The Mongol main force commander could extend feigned retreats for days or even weeks, and his opponents were never able to learn and easily fooled, being quite incompetent. So at any rate, the empire grew rapidly, in summary, under the rule of Genghis Khan and his descendants, who sent invasions in every direction. The vast transcontinental empire connected with the east with the west, enforcing Pax Mongolia. This allowed trade, technologies, commodities, and ideologies to dominate Eurasia. The empire, like all empires, was composed of powerful sub-bosses, and it split apart as the different gangs of rulers fought for independence from the center. The grandchildren of Genghis Khan, for example, found it convenient to fight over whether the royal line should follow from his son and initial heir, Ogadai, or alternatively should it follow one of his other sons, such as Tolui, Chagatai, or Jochi. The Tolui forces prevailed after a bloody purge of the Ogadai and Chagatai factions, but disputes continued among the descendants of the Tolui. After Manga Khan died, rival Kurotai councils simultaneously elected different successors. The brothers Arkbok and Kublai Khan then fought each other in the Tului Civil War. They each also had to handle challenges from descendants of other sons of Genghis, as shown in the Netflix series Marco Polo. Kublai successfully took power, but civil war ensued as Kublai Khan sought unsuccessfully to regain control of the Chagatai and Ogadai families. In AD 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, a Mongol advance was beaten and stopped in its tracks in direct combat. It marked a turning point of Mongol Western conquest. Not that they did not continue with more invasions and contemporary occupations of Syria and Palestine as far as Gaza. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment, because the contemporary capitalist historians are just as dumb as their employers, and they tend to think that somehow this stopping of the Mongols in a few battles in Southwest Asia was responsible for their gradual decline, but the truth is quite different, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. In AD 1299, it all came to an end in this part of the Old World after a decisive Egyptian and Mesopotamian victory at the Battle of Wadi al-Khanzadar. In AD 1294, Kublai Khan died. By this time, the Mongol Empire had fractured into 4 separate khanates. Each became an empire, albeit in junior in size to the granddaddy of them all, built by Kublai Khan. Each pursued its own interests with its own internal and foreign objectives. These 4 were the Golden Horde Khanate in the northwest, the Chagatai Khanate in the middle, the Ilkhanate Khanate in the southwest, and the Yuan Khanate in the east, which is modern-day Beijing. And this is the secret of why the Mongol Empire eventually dissolved. Now I'm going to go to this world map, which we have to use this time because the Mongol Empire stretches far beyond Northeast Asia. And what I want to point out is this. You've seen, because we just talked about it, how the Mongols defeated the Hungarians and the Poles handily. So they weren't stopped by anything here. And they would have regained the initiative in Palestine, but once they had taken the time to bring up sufficient fodder for their horses and men, and they had already the Tigris and Euphrates, so they knew about the wealth of Mesopotamia from the agricultural workers there, and they knew that they could get the same thing in Egypt, and they knew about the Roman colonies in Libya and Tunisia. So those were certainly pillaging targets. So why did they stop? Well, the answer is they had conquered China already, and that's what we have in the form of the Yuan dynasty. And in China, they found something that was completely new to them, and that was there was a much better profit center in the Chinese system of enforced slave labor in agriculture than there was in pillaging and raping communities along the way in these areas. And in fact, that was expensive, and it was going to be expensive to do this. Now, they could have done it militarily. There wasn't a military question that stopped them. What stopped them was the fact that there's much more money to be made in the Chinese system. And the Mongolian Empire was never defeated. It just gradually faded away because it was absorbed, in effect, by the Chinese. And in the next lectures, we're going to start looking at China, which is the real heart of East Asia, always has been, and continues to be to this very day. And so that is the real lesson of the Mongolian Empire. It's not that they were ever stopped militarily, because they never were. Nobody could stand up to them, as we have seen. And there wasn't anything that they faced over here in the Mediterranean coast that would have stopped them for very long. What stopped them was they didn't want to do that anymore. They were making a lot more money down here by using the Chinese system than they had ever made in all of this raping and pillaging of communities across Central Asia. So that is the real lesson to be learned from what happened to the Mongol Empire in the long run. They quit what they were doing because there was so much more money to be made on the Chinese system, and much cheaper. So about all you had to do was to continue what the Chinese had already been doing, which was to build walls to prevent peasants from escaping to the north, and which they had done for a long time. But they weren't going. These walls had been built for a long time in China, and then were finally put together as one complete wall and joined. In fact, if you watch read Xinhua like I do every day, or Beijing People's Daily, you'll see that whole new sections of the wall have been discovered and are being excavated archaeologically. So with that comment, we'll stop this particular lecture, and we will move on in the next lectures to the evolution of China from its prehistory through its various phases, and which are the classical phases of hunting and gathering, to tribal agriculture, to chiefdoms, simple chiefdoms, advanced theocratic chiefdoms, eventually become class-divided states, and those in turn are eventually divided into one empire by one emperor from the warring state of Qin. There were 6 warring states, as you're going to see there in China, and one of them finally took over all of the others with a philosophy which was, he called legalism. And at that time, Confucianism was a philosophy of the slaveholders, and legalism was a philosophy that granted a certain amount of freedom to the peasants in exchange for labor peace. In other words, it turned them into serfs instead of slaves. This is the reason that you have burials in China like the first emperor's tomb with all of the terracotta soldiers and horses. In previous times, those would have been live soldiers and horses. But as part of his legalistic philosophy, peasants were being spared from this particular kind of treatment. Well, at any rate, that takes care of lecture 54C, and in the next lectures we'll be dealing with China. And all of this will be in volume 3 when it comes out next year on communism in East Asia.